Welcome to our channel. Between November 9th and 13th, 1975, 3 companies from the 1st Special Forces Battalion of Cuba's Ministry of the Interior arrived in Angola with the mission to halt the South African advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive from Cuba. One of the companies was held in reserve and stationed for the 4th Battle of Cuba-in-war on November 10th. Although this company did not engage in combat, it was later deployed to Novo Redondo, Sumbe, where they carried out guerrilla tactics to delay the South African forces. One of their key actions involved destroying bridges that provided access to Luanda, thus significantly slowing the enemy's progress. The other 2 companies were immediately sent to the defensive line along the Cuba River to prepare for direct combat. On November 16, a Cuban Special Forces platoon was ambushed near Tunga by the South African forces. 2 Cuban soldiers that were captured, Jesus Montes y José La Madrid, were later executed. Despite these losses, the Cuban forces continued their resistance, and by November 20, during the Battle of Tunga, Cuban troops engaged in 4 separate skirmishes against the South Africans. These engagements forced the South Africans to alter their route eastward, redirecting their march towards Luanda. On November 23, 1975, the Cuban Special Forces participated in the Battle of Ibo. 2 platoons of the Special Forces Battalion, supported by FAPLA troops, confronted the South African forces and decisively defeated them. In the midst of the battle, 1st Lieutenant Juan Tamayo Castro tragically lost his life when he was struck by a bullet in the forehead. The fighting intensified as the month of December arrived. On December 10, during the Battle of Tongo Hills, Captain Antonio Tengido Gonzalez and Alife Naples, Katanga, fell in an ambush. Tengido suffered fatal injuries in a fierce firefight, while Katanga was killed attempting to retrieve Tengido's body, demonstrating the unyielding courage of the Cuban forces. Just 2 days later, on December 12, during the Battle of Catofe, Bridge 14, Trooper Juan Bernardo Ruiz Cruz, the youngest member of the Cuban forces at only 19 years old, died in combat. Later that day, Trooper Alcibiades Mengana Rubio, who had triggered a landmine, tragically took his own life to prevent being a burden on his comrades. However, they continued to hold critical positions and resist the South African advance. On December 31, Cuban forces were engaged in the Battle of the Madunda Hills, strategic high ground between Quibala and Sela. 1st Lieutenant Jorge Landero led the charge to dislodge the South African forces, but he was killed in the battle. Lieutenant Arturo Puig Ruiz de Villa took command and successfully completed the mission, only to fall in a brutal counterattack on January 1, 1976. In a desperate move to prevent the South Africans from regaining the hills, 1st Lieutenant Jesus Rodriguez and his squad called in artillery fire on their own positions. The BM-21 artillery barrage halted the enemy's advance and saved the Cuban position, although the Cuban forces had to endure the intense bombardment. These courageous actions were vital in delaying the South African forces long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Between November 27 and December 1, the first Cuban troop ships arrived in Luanda, bringing more than 1,250 troops along with their weapons, supplies, and heavy artillery. This was the first of many shipments, and over the next several months, more than 25,000 Cuban soldiers and hundreds of tons of equipment were transported to Angola, ultimately altering the course of the war. The sacrifices made by the Cuban Special Forces, particularly during the fierce battles in Tunga, Ibo, Tongo Hills, and the Madunda Hills, bought enough time for these reinforcements to arrive, turning the tide in favor of the Angolan government and Cuban forces. By the middle of 1976, a total of 12 Cuban Special Forces soldiers had lost their lives, but their bravery and actions were pivotal in halting the South African invasion and shaping the outcome of the conflict. Continue watching our videos to learn more stories about the Angola War.